Let me start off with our first presenter, Samir Khatiwada, who will be presenting the paper, COVID-19 and Labor Markets in Southeast Asia, Who Was Hurt Most and What Policies Have Helped, written in cooperation with his colleagues at the ADB. This will be followed by our discussant, Shaianne Osterreich. So, Samir, floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here, and many thanks for organizing this panel. I'm going to try to keep the time of 15 minutes. So first, yes, we are working. This research looks at Southeast Asia in particular. So the basic outline of my presentation, I don't want to go too much into this, but I'll start by basically highlighting the couple of research questions that we focus on for this work, and then the data that we have used and the methods that we have used in the paper. And the main findings, and you'll see from the main findings, is that the impact channels and aggregate impact on the labor market, and also the transition across labor force status, all of these sort of 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, you will see that there are a lot of them is more descriptive nature in terms of our main findings at this stage, because it's very much a work in progress. And number 4, what policies have mitigated the impact? And here I'll be focusing on social protection measures that were put in place, social protection and labor market measures. And the next step, so because as I said, it's an ongoing work, so we are still looking at how do we assess the policy response during the pandemic. And as Michael rightly highlighted at the very beginning, it's actually, the crisis is not over yet, right? So it's interesting to even talk about this, but in terms of the time that we have covered, the period I would highlight at the outset is 2020 and then early 2021. So the two questions we have tried to answer in the paper. The first is, how did labor markets in Southeast Asia adjust to the COVID-19 shock, and who has been hurt the most? And here, the 5 countries we have looked at: Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Here we look at the scale and shape of impacts and adjustment patterns. And then what I will do is I'll dig a bit deeper into what I call vulnerable groups. We will define this as we go forward. And the second question that we try to answer in the paper is, what policies have mitigated the impact? And this is very interesting, and it's an ongoing work, and I'll present some insights that we have in the paper so far. The data that we have used, it's mostly labor force survey data that we have obtained from the NSOs in the 5 countries. In many cases, we had to purchase the database, we meaning the Asian Development Bank. I'm with the ADB. In case of Indonesia, the LFS is not quarterly, it's biannual, so it's February and August. We have also used alternative and supplementary sources of data. The one that it's worth that I wanted to highlight here is the one by ADBI, the Asian Development Bank Institute. They did household surveys in ASEAN countries during the pandemic, and this has been a very useful source of information for us. The second is the second source of data for the paper is on social protection and policy response. Here, the ILO social protection report that came out towards the end of last year, I believe in September, is very nice. So we have made use of data from that, and also the World Bank's Aspire database as well. And lastly, IPC for inclusive growth. This one, we made use of social protection response to COVID-19 in the Global South as well. These are some of the data sources in the paper. The methods really is quite simple, well, quite straightforward, I would say, to understand, given what we have done. First, what we do is we use pseudo panels constructed by sex and age cohorts to follow across sort of demographic groups and across labor force status and transition within employment, mostly in 2020 and also early 2021 as well. And then the disaggregation of impact along various dimensions. And here, vulnerable or affected groups, because as you can imagine, for a lot of these countries, if you didn't know, I'm assuming most people on the call know that the informal share of employment is very large in many of these countries. So it's important to sort of differentiate the impact by formal and informal employment, and also the type of work arrangement, temporary, short-term, daily workers, and also the occupational group and skill level. And this, we have some really nice findings on the skill level, what type of workers have been impacted. And the enterprise size here, looking at sort of the, the micro, small, medium enterprises, workers who work in those, how they have fared as well. And what we do is we decompose the total working hour losses to assess to which extent the intensive and extensive margins of origins, extensive margins of adjustment, were used at different stages of the crisis, because the job loss itself doesn't quite capture the overall impact on the labor market. So we do look at the intensive margin of adjustment as well. And then we sort of look at some of the ways that countries have put in place intensive sort of, reducing hours worked, given, for example, if some of the work can be done remotely or not. So those things we have looked at as well. We've constructed something called teleworkability index. Let me start.
Samir?
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but you realize you're only on your first slide. Did you mean to go through your PowerPoint?
Oh, sorry. I've been moving on my slides here. Oh, never mind. You're only on the first slide?
Yeah, we can only see the first slide, unfortunately.
Oh,
maybe try to unshare and share again. Maybe it just got stuck.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm so sorry, Michael. I thought
No, it's not your fault.
I'm on slide 5 at my end. Let me see. Let me see. I don't know what happened. Wow. Okay. Stop share. Let me try again. This is bizarre. Okay. Which slide do you see now?
Slide 5. Slide 5 now. That's good.
Okay. I'm afraid of making a full screen because let me try. Can you see slide 6?
Yep. You fixed it.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go full screen. I hope nothing messes up. Okay. My apologies for that. I should have asked. You can see this now, right? The COVID-19 impacts, the different graphs, 3 panels. Okay, great. So here, my apologies that the fonts are a bit small. If you just look at Philippines on the left-hand side there at the top, what we are looking at is the
Sorry, Samir, we're on slide where it says key findings, impact channels, and aggregate effects.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, every time I try to share, I think something happens. Try to expand, something messes up. So I'm just gonna.
We've got some figures. Yeah, that's 7. Slide 7.
I'll just go like this if you don't mind. I'll just go like this so that in the interest of time. Okay. On Philippines here. So on the left-hand side, the green rectangle is transition out of employment. And then the blue is exit from the labor force, and the red is transition into unemployment. And as you can see, if you just look at the Philippines, most of the job losses took place in Q2 2020, Q2, Q3, and things improved towards the last quarter of 2020 and then early 2021 in the Philippines. And we see a similar story across different countries. What you also have there is the pink sort of shaded area, which is total cases per million. And then the dotted, so the line at the top is the stringency index. This is from Oxford University. They've been tracking this. What I wanted to do is to point out that there has been some labor, there has been labor market recovery in the past 3 quarters, I would say. But of course, because last year, because of Delta variant, and now because of the new variant, there's a bit of uncertainty. But when you look at the recovery in employment, we are not quite at the pre-pandemic level. And here, what I've done is those rectangles that you see there, the sort of highlighted rectangles, employment to population ratio, all of those, for all the countries we have looked at, the employment population ratio remains lower than pre-pandemic. And also the labor force participation rate as well is lower than pre-pandemic. And of course, as we said in the outset, we are not quite out of the woods yet. Let me get into the across sort of age and sex cohort, because there's some interesting stories here. Here I'm showing you the same graphs, but by male and female, and also by age cohort. What I would like to do is to draw your attention to those gray bars, the gray part of the bar there on the right hand side. What those are exits from the labor force. And what's interesting is that you see that for the countries we have looked at, more women exited the labor force than men did after a job loss. That's one. The second interesting story is that if you look at Thailand and Vietnam, for example, if you look at the younger age cohort, a lot of the women also left the labor force altogether after a job loss. And one of the things we say in the paper is that because of the burden of care falls a lot on women, and we might be seeing this this type of pattern in these countries. The second set of findings is on the youth. The youth share in job losses is higher than their share in employment across most heavily affected sectors. And here I picked a few. In case of Philippines, for example, the top left, in education, youth comprise of 17% of total employment. But when you look at the job loss, 51% of all job losses in the sector were borne by youth. Similarly, in case of Vietnam, we see that in manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade, accommodation and food services. And it's worth mentioning is that, for example, a sector like wholesale and retail trade usually tends to absorb workers during times of crisis. But here, because personal contact wasn't really allowed, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a lot of job losses in that sector as well. And one thing that stands out when you look at Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, is the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector was really, I'll get into this in a second, was heavily impacted during the pandemic. And here again, youth comprise a large share of the job losses in these sectors. And one of the questions we asked ourselves is there evidence of more detachment among women? Because I told you that earlier, women left the labor force after a job loss, right, at the height of the pandemic. But as it turns out, a lot of them did enter back. But then what is interesting is that the entry back has been into lower quality employment, in sort of on-account work, self-employed work, which mostly is what we mean by on-account self-employment in these countries. Actually, we're talking about informal employment, and we see that across the countries. Let me get into the sector story. Labor reallocation across sectors, did we see it or not? And one thing that stands out looking at this is that the first row there, agriculture sector. If you look at the agriculture sector, normally agriculture sector tends to, my apologies, Michael and colleagues, the fonts are a little too small, but anyway, the agriculture sector normally tends to absorb workers during times of crisis. And what we saw this time around, actually, not quite the case. I mean, in some cases we did see that, but not quite the case across the countries. For example, Philippines, the lockdown measures were quite strict, especially in Q2, Q3 of 2020, which made it very difficult for folks to move to provinces after they lost their jobs in, say, manufacturing sector. So that we saw less of that, and we saw more of that as we headed into Q4 2020, Q1 2021. But of course, the Delta variant added a bit more. The lockdown measures came back. So there was a bit of that taking place. So the sectors that typically absorb workers were heavily impacted. Manufacturing, as I said, was one of the most impacted sectors, and we see accommodation and food service. Here, of course, the personal contact is very important, and that sector was also impacted across these countries. And in some countries, mobility restrictions and other containment measures limited sectoral reallocation in Q2. And here, again, I think I already said this, we saw this a lot in the Philippines as well. Let me show you a table here. I hope you can see this. This is sort of the employment, the job gains in Q3 2020 versus Q2 2020. And if you just focus on the column, the third column, which is self-employed, self-employed did see an increase. And again, self-employed in countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam basically means lower quality employment. So a lot of the folks enter back into the labor market, but they went into self-employed status. And also unpaid family worker, another category that tends to also, a lot of the folks moved into that labor force status as they re-entered the labor force. And as I said at the outset, job losses only capture a part of the story, but there were, in a lot of the cases, we did see that working hours were reduced. So folks didn't lose their jobs, but their hours were reduced. And we saw that in a large set of countries and sectors. In these countries and sectors, especially Indonesia and the Philippines. We see this in Indonesia and the Philippines. If you look at all those sectors, if you see anything more than 50, you're looking at a majority of adjustment was taken place by the intensive margin of adjustment. And we try to kind of look at this by understanding the intensive margins of adjustment by looking at teleworkability and MSME share, temporary worker share, wage employment share, low skill share. And here we're just trying to see what made most sense. And I think, this, it's not the most convincing finding in this correlation matrix. But one thing it's worth mentioning is that for wage and salaried employment, every time there was, of course, teleworkability potential, that was intensive margins of adjustment was used, and which kind of makes sense, right? Because in a lot of the wage and salaried employment are your better employment, sort of your more non-routine cognitive type of employment. There we saw more of intensive margins of adjustment. Let me quickly talk about, I don't know, Michael, how much time I have. I hope I have.
You have 1 minute and 13 seconds.
Okay, all right. So I have this really interesting chart, this one. I hope you can see this by skill, and I'm going to spend the next 30 seconds, 40 seconds on this. So what we saw is that differential impact across groups of workers. And here, so I have shown skilled, low skilled, and semi-skilled. And within that, you have different sort of occupational categories that you see there. And what is interesting is that, say, for example, take Vietnam, right? In Vietnam, most of the job losses were in low-skilled category, right? So almost close to 50%. And when you look at semi-skilled, and semi-skilled category also comprise a large share of job losses in all of these countries. And semi-skilled, what do we mean by semi-skilled? One occupation is worth mentioning is service and sales workers. This is just how it's classified normally. Service and sales workers are semi-skilled. They're considered semi-skilled. But this requires personal contact. Hence, a lot of these folks did lose jobs during the height of the pandemic. This is one. The other one you also see is this craft and related trade workers and plant machine operators and assemblers. So these are some of your manufacturing sector type jobs as well. The plant machine operators and assemblers, the dark gray ones. These are semi-skilled workers. So again, we saw job losses there as well. But what this picture shows is that a lot of the low-skilled workers were impacted, and also semi-skilled worker. And in semi-skilled worker, we're talking about manufacturing, where manufacturing is already facing the risk of automation. And hence, this is a very interesting insight from this work. And again, I've already talked about the vulnerable groups, so I'm going to skip this. One last thing I wanted to kind of mention is that the social protection. Pre-pandemic social protection gaps across the region were huge, but it's mostly related to informality. And a lot of the social protection programs focus on social assistance measures, so cash transfer schemes, which are easier to administer and also more effective. What we saw during the pandemic is that, so you look at the left-hand side, some of these programs in Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, Vietnam, I picked specific programs. Here they were expanded because during the crisis to help workers. Let me leave with the last slide here. So we want to expand the analysis, but of course, data is a problem. The second bullet point there is that this work is supposed to be relevant for our ADB's operations, for our lending operations. So what we're doing is that we're looking for entry points for developing and strengthening social protection programs in the region. So it's very much linked to our operations in Southeast Asia. And now what I've been doing with my co-authors is that, can we assess some of the policy responses? And that's where the work is right now. That's it, Michael, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Samir. I'm sorry to make you rush like that. But let me invite our discussant for this piece, Shaianne Osterreich, to give her comments.
Hi, thank you so much. I've just put some comments into a few slides myself, so I'm just gonna pop them up here. And I know we don't have a lot of time. Can you see it okay? Okay, so I just want to comment, I'm not going to go into all these amazing parts because I have it here, and I will send you some comments as well, because I'm really interested in this work. So it's just really great. You can tell by the PPT, but also in the paper, so much specific detail and very well reproduced to really elevate the points, and really thoughtful consideration of social protection gaps that were in place in the first place. I think uplifting work from the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth was really good to see that integrated. The sectoral analysis and the informal sector analysis is both really good. My comments, my suggestion comments are going to focus on the gender dimension because that's one of my areas of interest, and I think they have an impact on potentially the policy and next steps. Samir mentioned it in his presentation, and it is in the paper. The part about the care burden is in the paper, but it is relatively small, and it doesn't show up again in terms of areas for further analysis. So I did a project for the UNDP this summer on care in Thailand and labor force participation with some emphasis on COVID era period. So I also want to call your attention to, there was a rapid gender assessment from UN Women and a UNDP UN Women COVID policy database. So you had mentioned in the paper a few databases that identified policies that were related to social protection, but there was also one that was specific to gender and went to women. And it's not a big surprise because across the whole globe, there were a lot of women that the care work burden was, highly intensified. It's more in the news. It's more on the tips of people's thinking, but actually integrating it into the analysis is less common. So your paper starts doing that, and it would be great to see it thread more into the later analysis. Just as a tiny little snapshot to this, I thought I would pop up. This is just from the labor force data in Thailand comparing 2019 and 2021. And they ask a question about why are you not in the labor force? And in their labor force survey, they have the option of doing housework is one of those answers. And you can see the blue lines are the new respondents doing more housework. They've left the labor market because of doing more housework in age groups 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, all the way up to 50. All of those groups have left the labor market to do more housework. So it's just a really, you bring it up in the paper, but I think in terms of threading it through, and it also threads through not just the care burden, but gender analysis related to the sectors. So women are more likely to be unemployed or to become more informally employed in areas where there's, more cost sensitive manufacturing. And then they're also more likely, virtually any sector, to have poorer contracts. So they're more likely to be laid off there. And looking more at employment status, sort of tracking the unpaid contributing family worker, which again, your paper does, but it doesn't link up necessarily to the policies at the end. And because we know that there weren't any, and I know the paper is sort of about an analysis of policies that did happen, but in terms of ADP support for policies that are moving forward, thinking about those gender dimensions and not a sort of gender blind social protection approach could have a big impact. Thank you so much for all that detailed work.